Hello, and thank you for keeping your appointment with Ghouls magazine as we are here to celebrate 50 years of The Wicker Man. My name's Rebecca McCallum, and I'm assistant editor of Ghouls magazine, but just on this occasion, you can call me Lady Summerisle. And joining me at my May Day parade are some of Summerisle's finest. So I begin my introductions with none other than the pub landlord, Mike Snoonian. Mike is a podcaster, a writer, and a licensed therapist whose chosen focus is horror and mental health. He's also co-host of the Pod and the Pendulum podcast. Hello, Mike. How you doing?
Hey, Rebecca. Thank you for having me. I'm super thrilled to be here.
Well, thank you for being here. Moving on to our harbour master, Ali Taylor. Ali is a film scholar, author of Troubled Every Day, the Devil's Advocate book on possession, and has another book in progress, I believe. I don't know if Ali might be able to tell us more about that later, but hi, Ali. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Rebecca. I'm super glad to be here as well. I've just warned my co-presenters that it is 5 a.m. where I'm coming from, so forgive me if I'm a little bit, I need my coffee.
We've already agreed that we forgive Ali everything today. It is 5 a.m. So
don't sacrifice me. I'm trying.
Next, we have our resident school teacher, Harriet Fletcher, who is a writer and academic, a lecturer in media and communications with a focus on pop culture, feminism, and horror. Harriet is also one of our wonderful contributors at Ghouls magazine and a bimboologist, and we've had plenty of great conversations about that. The work she does there is incredible. Hi, Harriet.
Hello, very much looking forward to chatting with everyone and very excited to be here.
Thank you. And I am also super pleased to have with us our island librarian, Lakkaya Palmer. Lakkaya is a contributor to Ghouls magazine. She is a PhD student at UCL, and the title of her study is The Ferocious Father, Masculinity and Fatherhood in American Horror Cinema. And I am so excited to hear her contributions to the discussion tonight. Hello, Lakkaya.
Hi, Rebecca, and hi, everyone. I'm super honored to be here and to talk about one of my favorite films.
And last, but by no means least, where would we be without our gravedigger, Becci Sayce? Becci is a freelance entertainment journalist with bylines at Dread Central, Digital Spy, and MetroUK. She is the interviews editor at Film Hounds magazine and is also a contributor to Ghouls magazine. Welcome, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Really excited to dig in to everything we've got to talk about The Wicker Man.
Lovely. Okay, so let's kick it off then. There's plenty to talk about. So my first question is, The Wicker Man is 50 years old, and I can hardly believe it. It feels like it's a film that's always been there, and in many ways it feels really timeless. But what is it about The Wicker Man then that has meant that it continues, do you think, to be so well loved? And why has it endured for so long for you personally and for film lovers in general? And I am going to start with, and I feel bad now, it's 5 a.m., but I'm going to start with you, Ali.
That's all right. Let's break the seal. Look, for me, I mean, I've loved this film. I've seen it many, many times over the years. So I'm so glad when I saw your panel. I think part of it's the timelessness of the themes, that stepping into the unknown, something you truly just can't understand. I mean, it's in a lot of horror movies, but I think it's done particularly differently here. Anything that can scare me during sort of the daytime is pretty impressive. And I think it's still somehow it's real testament to its achievement is how dreadful it still makes me feel, even though it's decades old. You know, some horror movies you go back and go, well, that's dated badly. I really loved that at the time, but this one, no, I think they've really got the sense of dread just stays there. And I really, I think for me, it's that stepping into the unknown that has just captured it for forever.
Yeah, so for you, is it about is the location a lot to do with it as well, like the isolation?
the location and this guy who feels like he's very powerful in his regular everyday life. You can tell he's used to wielding this kind of authority around it, and you sort of walk into this space where it's like none of those rules that you live your life by apply anymore, and so your usual recourse is just gone from you, and that's scary for him.
Yeah, it's a world in chaos for Howie, definitely, isn't it?
But they're so comfortable, right? Because they're just doing their thing and they know everything about the landscape and the rules and their customs, and he's just a fish out of water. But has come in so kind of arrogantly. I kind of love it.
Yeah. Becci, what about you?
For me, it works on sort of two levels. First of all, I think it's how it deals with sort of its conversations around religion and faith. I think there's something about that really resonates with horror viewers, both then and today. I mean, we've had an Exorcist film in cinemas this year. There's something still so scary about different belief systems that we don't necessarily subscribe to, and how we see that through Silent Howie and through Lord Summerisle and the villages in Summerisle, that clash, but also the similarities, I think is such an interesting exploration in the film. And then secondly, and what really made it stand out to me, what really captured my imagination with it when I first saw it as a teenager and still now, is just how strange it is. Like, we go from a crime drama whodunit to a musical in like a step, not even a few steps. It changes so rapidly. And then you've got such a violent, horrific ending, all wrapped up in this strange sort of eccentric British humour. You won't see many other films like it. And I don't think there's been any since that have really captured the same just strange, playful, sinister, unnerving feeling that The Wicker Man has.
Yeah, I like that. It's kind of, to me, it's almost like something between a dream and a nightmare. It's dreamy, but it's also nightmarish at the same time, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It does so well. Like, even in how it's shot, like 1 minute it seems like spring, 1 minute it seems like autumn because of like when it was filmed not being in spring, all the strange like bright colours and then sudden dreary weather. It doesn't seem real. It is like when you're in a dream, and it's based in reality, but there's little things that are off that tell you that you're asleep. And that's what The Wicker Man's like for its entire runtime.
Yeah, it's very like the things you're speaking to there, it's making me think about how disorientating it can be as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that definitely plays into the fear as well, both, like Ali said, with how he steps completely out of his comfort zone to a world that he doesn't understand. It's very much the same for the viewer as well. It does feel like you can't quite get your foot in throughout with what's going on until the very end of the film when it's all sort of wrapped up in a neat little bow.
A neat little bow, that's an interesting way to describe it. Lakkaya, what about you? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, to replicate kind of what's already been said, the landscape I've always found very interesting, and I think this is why we have this kind of cultural obsession now with like folk horror, right? And I think that is to do with like the landscape. I see these kind of similarities and differences with the landscape of the Wicker Man and like Midsummer now, and how, I don't know, like Midsummer kind of becomes this kind of evolution of folk horror that started, you know, with the Wicker Man. So that's really interesting. But also I love the film because technically no one's in the wrong. Both the Summer Islanders and Howie stand so strong in their own belief systems. But I think what's really interesting about it is the representation of Howie. And I'm compelled by it because he does think the Islanders are up to no good, which they technically are, if you're him. And he follows these kind of strong convictions that he has, ends up right, and then gets killed for that. So it's quite interesting because he could have left the island at any point. I think they even say to him, you won't want to be around for May Day. So naturally, of course, he stays, right? So that's something that I've always found compelling about it, these interesting and timeless themes of gender, of landscape, of belief systems. So yeah.
Yeah, Midsummer, that's like another folk horror that's set in the daytime, in the broad daylight. And then also, you know, I like what you spoke to there about, it's hard to to position yourself morally as to, you know, whose side do you fall down on. And I like how the film really allows you to kind of to seesaw between, and to really, it's very difficult to land on who to empathize with at different times, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. I still don't know if I'm Team Howie or Team Lord Summerisle.
We'll do a little hands up at the end. We'll see. Harriet, what about you?
I definitely agree with the kind of the timeless themes of it, like absolutely, and also the genre experimentation. I think that is so unusual, but it's definitely, you can definitely see how it's kind of influenced later films as well. For me personally, I think it epitomizes what I find most scary in a horror film, which is people doing horrifying things to people, as opposed to, say, kind of like a supernatural force involved. I think it's the idea of people being so ingrained in their beliefs, you know, to the point of, I guess you could say, kind of being brainwashed, that they will kind of go to extreme lengths, they will kind of enact violence, and that no sense of reason or no kind of outside influence will stop them. And again, as Ali was saying, it's that kind of idea of being trapped. So Howie is this kind of outsider. He's in a new situation. He is not. No one is going to help him because he's the only person who doesn't believe in what everyone else believes. So I think it's that idea of being trapped, but also people being kind of brainwashed into doing kind of like horrifically violent things that I find so horrifying in horror in general. But I think folk horror and the Wicker Man do this particularly well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's the believability of it, isn't it? Like you say, it's not supernatural. And also just picking up on, I was just thinking about Kaya's point about, you know, Howie being able to leave, and that maybe there being, we're talking about timeless themes, and maybe there being some kind of connection with like this being almost like a tragedy, and Howie having some kind of tragic flaw maybe, and that's what keeps him there. I find that interesting. But Mike, what about you?
Yeah, I think it's the fanaticism that really draws me, both like behind the scenes and also what we see. I mean, because this was very much a passion project for Christopher Lee. Like, this movie was only made because he willed it into existence. Like, he really wanted to do something different from what he was most known for with Hammer horror, and you see a much different villain in Christopher Lee with this movie. Where we're used to seeing him playing Count Dracula and being like this like gothic villain and very athletic and very urbane. And here, there's just something so different about him, and it's a more psychological villain. And hearing him reduce Christianity to its ridiculousness in one sentence, when he's like, oh, this thing about the virgin who sleeps with a ghost, right? Like, when you boil it down to that, it's like, yes, that actually does sound quite silly. And that's actually a very scary thought. So that fanaticism of Christopher Lee to like make this movie and the passion that goes into it, you feel that whenever you watch this movie. Like, but also the fanaticism of everybody on the island, and including poor Sergeant Howie. Everyone is so steadfast in their beliefs, with maybe the exception of Lord Summerisle, like with the exception of Lee's character, who I think is just like, if I can trick these local rubes, I get the big house on the top of the hill, and, you know, my pick of the local ladies that are gonna like sit by my side. So I got to keep this gravy train rolling for a bit. But everybody else is really invested in their belief system to the point where people are going to die for it. And that is a very terrifying thought, because they go happily, they're very happily to execute people. And I find it fascinating. Like, well, you know, who's in the wrong here? There are no villains until there are villains in this movie. Like, and I would wager I'm on team don't burn people alive. Like that, I tend to be anti burning people alive. And that happily burning Sergeant Howie at the end and like making it a song and dance number at the end, akin to something you would see from the Muppets, like that. That is horrifying to me, more horrifying than what you would see in a Friday the 13th or Halloween movie.
Yeah, I like that you spoke about fanaticism in making the film, and then I guess it's within the film, and then it has a fanatic following as well. So it's got all those like reflections. So yeah, I like that, and maybe it's one of the things that's interesting in this film that I don't know if we get to spend too much time on is that kind of the collective and what we're prepared to do when we're part of a collective that we mightn't do if we were an individual on our own, which I think is interesting, don't you?
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, so Lakkaya's kind of touched on it already, but in folk horror, the landscape's such a fundamental ingredient. And here we've got not only the removed location, which we've already mentioned, arguably for both Howie and the Summer Isles, because they're kind of they're all isolated, I feel. And there's an impact on that, both for the people that live there and for Howie, very different. But the idea of the harvest is there as well, and the importance of the landscape and the earth, you know, as this form of nourishment and survival. I'm interested in some of your thoughts on the role of the environment in the Wicker Man and how it might contribute to its themes and the sensations of horror that we experience. And Lakkaya, I'm going to start with you.
Yep. Hi. That's a really interesting question because as I mentioned before, it just kind of reminds me of Midsummer in this, the landscape's so dreamlike and beautiful at points that you can't really imagine anything bad happening there, but there's these little hints of it, right? Like, I don't know, like a hair, or, you know, the women dancing naked around the maypole, which is quite interesting because it's like, there's something uncanny about this place, but yet it still is so beautiful. And I think that's what makes the horror of this film worse. The landscape almost tricks you into this false sense of security because of its dreamlikeness. So that, like, the ending for me on first watch, I was really shocked that it happened. I shouldn't have been, but I was. So yeah, there's something about the way the landscape intersects with the horror element, right, and how it can create this sensation of fairy tale that's then crippled into a nightmare.
Oh, I love that expression. Crippled into a nightmare. Yeah, that fairy tale was literally the word I was about to say. And I love that idea that you're exploring there of the island, or certainly the aesthetic of the film as well, subverting our expectations. Yeah, that's really interesting. Harriet, what about you?
So something I was really struck by on a rewatch, the visuals of the landscape, but kind of how it's discussed, was I was really struck by the story about the apples. So the story, the story of the apples is that the Summer Isle family kind of years back developed this new strain of apple that they could then grow on the island. And then that's presumably the kind of economy of the island and how they kind of make their money. And then that's also kind of presumably why they do the rituals, because the crops or the yield has failed and they want to kind of continue growing the apples. And I was kind of struck by how the community is about kind of worshipping nature and the natural world, but actually there's a kind of curious sense of natural and artificial on the island because of this kind of like, I guess, kind of unnatural strain of food that they're trying to grow. So I was kind of, it kind of made me think how there is kind of contradiction in the beliefs and in this sense of kind of worshipping nature and worshipping the environment. And I think I kind of agree with you, Mike, in that the cynic in me would say, does Lord Summer Isle actually believe in any of this, or is it just a way for him to kind of maintain his power? Because it doesn't strike me as a kind of a natural place. I guess, like Lakkaya was saying, it's a very kind of like otherworldly and to some extent artificial place as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the more that we're talking, I'm thinking, yeah, this should be idyllic, but that artifice as well, and maybe what that might be concealing as well. When I think about landscape, and I always think about how it can reveal things but conceal things as well, which is interesting. But Mike, what have you got to say about this?
Well, I think that it's fascinating. It's an island that's ruled by an island. Like it's its own, almost like its own sovereign little nation. Like they're completely kind of unconcerned with what's going on the mainland whatsoever, and Howie is trying to remind them over and over again, like, look, you're ruled by a Christian, we're supposed to be a Christian country, you're ruled by Christian rulers, and they pay that absolutely no mind whatsoever. They almost find that like kind of quaint and almost charming that he would try to remind them of that, as they kind of like send him about on his like merry little goose chase. And Ali had said this earlier, that one of the things that makes this movie so terrifying is everything takes place in broad daylight. Everything takes place right under Howie's nose, and that makes that all the scarier. And this movie is taking place right during a really big change in horror, where, you know, we're getting rid of like you know, you're not getting like gothic castles. You're not like seeing everything take place during pounding rainstorms, and it's not like mad scientist horror or creature horror anymore. What we're finding in the 70s now is like horror shifting towards the horrors men do to one another. Like we're ending up being the monsters, and that's very much what the Wicker Man is. It's an early example of the horrors that men do to one another. And I think that is what is fascinating, and what makes it all the scarier here is like, this is such a beautiful landscape. It's idyllic. It's the kind of place that you would kind of want to go visit for a long weekend away and kind of go tour through these apple orchards, and it just looks so ideal. Like nothing bad should happen here, and yet here we are.
Yeah, and I like what you said there about it all happening under Howie's nose, and it made me think, well, for the first time we watch it, it happens under our noses as well, and perhaps we don't catch it. So I like how that connects. Ali, what about you?
Yeah, the remoteness of it, I think, has always really struck me. It's like something about it's remote and it's far away from everyone else, but at the same time, that remoteness becomes its own form of proximity for these people, in that as soon as he lands on that island, starts, you know, showing the photograph around, you really do believe, oh, everyone knows everyone, like everyone's in each other's business. And so of course they would know if she was on that island. And so it's part of, that remoteness that's proximate at the same time is fascinating in terms of the landscape. But the other thing was the way that reinforces this idea of the insider-outsider binary. It's like, if you're not part of that calendar or the temporality with the, you know, we have the ritual and it's May Day and this has to happen and this has to happen in order for this sacrifice, and everyone who's in each other's pockets knows the rules of how that's functioning. And then you've got Howie, who just steps in and has no clue as to what he's up against. And I think that, I've sort of mentioned it before, I'm noticing it again on a rewatch of just how forthright he is, that he can master this. And it's like, buddy, you don't have a clue. That scene where he first walks into the inn or the tavern, and you really get that you're not from around here, are you, kind of look. No one needs to say it, but it's just like, he's so out of place from this remoteness, and feels like he's still got what it takes. You know, I just need to solve this mystery and do everything I do back home, and I'll of course I can get on top of it. I think the remoteness for me really just stands out as part of its creepiness as well.
Yeah, and what you've said there made me think about, you know, about proximity. About, I guess, one thing that it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think one thing we all perhaps crave more of is community, and relationships with neighbors and friends and face-to-face relationships. But for me, there's the idea as well of this close proximity. It is almost part of that is quite horrific to me as well. This idea that everybody knows everybody, and what you spoke to there, Ali, about, you know, everyone having to be part of this program, and they're not seeming to be, certainly on Summerisle, a space for people to challenge the structures and what goes on there. So yeah, wow, you really made me think there. Becci, what about you?
One thing that I think is really key to the terror in The Wicker Man is how intrinsically its commentary on the environment is linked to the full cycle of like birth, life, and death. Even through like small things in the narrative we see, like when we see a breastfeeding woman in a graveyard holding an egg, and then they find a hair in the grave, obviously both symbolic of fertility, to really like blatant symbolism, like the inn being called the Green Man Inn, which is obviously a god linked to fertility in paganism, and the children dancing around the maypole and jumping over the fire in rituals for fertility. And I think it's quite scary that it deals with in the film the fact that the failing crop and failing fertility can be so detrimental to the island. Presumably, the apples failing, the crops failing, negatively affects their economy and leads them to do some quite drastic things. Well, quite drastic is an understatement. Very, very drastic things in the ending to ensure that fertility, that harvest is successful. But then on another level, it confronts our fear of birth, life, and death. Like, it makes the viewer and the people within the film as well, like through the villagers in Summerisle, confront their own feelings towards their own fertility and their own mortality on Earth, and then life after death as well in its closing scenes.
Wow, that's fascinating. I think there's a Ghouls editorial in you, Becci, on this.
Absolutely. I'm always happy to talk about birth and death in horror.
So that links on quite nicely then to my next question, which is about rituals of nature. And we've kind of already touched on nature, but part of the DNA of folk horror is the presence of nature and the performance of rituals. And we've mentioned some of those examples, the maypole dancing, the fertility rituals that you mentioned, Becci, to sacrifices, and these are all done really in tandem with an acknowledgement and an honouring. How honourable that honouring is, I guess, is up for debate, but an honouring, at least intention to, or performative intention, I guess, towards the power of nature. And I'm interested to hear what people think about both the beauty and the freedom of these rituals and the questionable morality of them as they escalate. And Becci, I'm going to come back to you.
Yeah, I think it's very, very interesting in The Wicker Man, similarly that we see in other films around the same sort of times, such as like Peeping Tom, that we're sort of positioned with the antagonist. I mean, like Mike said, it's very interesting to see who is right or wrong in the narrative. But I think it's interesting that we are sort of positioned to almost agree with the people on Summerisle. Like, they're celebrating nature, they're celebrating birth, they're celebrating sexuality. It's all things that realistically a lot of people now see as, it's a good thing. And then I think that makes the ending all the more shocking when it suddenly changes like that to we're burning a man in a wicker man because we believe these beliefs. And it is quite scary when throughout all these beautiful rituals, and they are beautiful, they're surrounded by flowers, by fruit, by happy dancing women and children, but they're exactly the things that I think are quite horrific. So when we look at it from a different angle, it's a cult indoctrinating children to murder a man, and they don't question it. The children especially don't question it, and it seems the adults don't either, or if they do, they don't care. So I think that's another thing that really, really boils down to the horror in The Wicker Man.
Yeah, your point about the children's interesting because we talk a lot about the adults, but yeah, that's a really interesting point. Mike?
Sorry, I just had trouble unmuting. Yeah, I think that's interesting what Becci just said there, because I think what can happen is like really good things, like you said, like being in touch with nature and being in touch with your sexuality are all wonderful things, but really good things can be perverted and really good things can be used for nefarious means, and they can be weaponized. And I think that's what has happened here. And I think in the case of the rituals, what has happened is like when the rituals are used as a means of like, well, it's always been this way, it allows the individual or the group to say, to kind of take themselves off the hook in such a way. It's like, well, this is the way that it's always been done. And it allows you to kind of absolve yourself of any sort of responsibility. They don't really have to see Howie as a human being like they are human beings at that point. They don't have to allow him any agency. They just see him as a collection of traits that they need in order to fulfill this ritual at this point, because Howie has no agency whatsoever. He just checks all the boxes. And why does he check all the boxes? It's because we have all of these rituals that we have to fulfill. And that's where it becomes like extremely nefarious. And rituals and tradition, that is like another way that cults can draw you in. And I think it's ironic. I think that the scene with the children outside when the boys are dancing around the maypole is like a really powerful one, because on one hand, like, it's a really beautiful song and it's kind of nice, especially like I work in education myself as a counselor. It's actually nice to see kids outside playing and laughing and getting their education that way, but they're also being indoctrinated into this system at an extremely young age, and they're using dance, they're using play, and they're using song as a way to indoctrinate these kids into a system that can be used for these really nefarious means. And I think that's kind of a fascinating thing to see here as well.
Wow, yeah, no, that is fascinating, that dichotomy of the beauty of the image, and like you say, like how lovely to see kids just outside. But when we examine the underbelly of what's going on there, yeah, it's pretty dark.
And you think the Islanders, like at one point, like Lee's character says, like the missionaries just give up. Like once the Islanders get food and shelter again, the missionaries are like, well, our job here, we're never going to come back from this. And what the Islanders have done is they've traded in one form of control for another form of control. Like they're happy to be oppressed as long as their needs are being met. And that's just what they've done. They've gone back to rituals that just make them happy and put food in their bellies.
Yeah, exactly. And Kaya, what about you?
So I definitely find the rituals beautiful, again, dreamlike and idyllic. The planting of trees when someone is dead, I find that really really powerful. And like was it the pregnant woman and other women that were dancing naked? It's quite interesting because as someone already mentioned, it becomes reminiscent of like a cult, but also like possibly like witches as well. I think of the phrase like all of them witches, right? But these rituals are obviously ones that Howie cannot understand because they're that alien to him. And because he's a God-fearing man, you can tell that he truly believes that this is blasphemy and work of the devil. So I can see why he's conflicted by these rituals when they're presented to him, because he obviously sees them as kind of evil and oppressive somewhat, but the Islanders see them as a form of freedom and even empowerment. So it's interesting to see how that plays out from both sides. And when Howie has he has quite an interesting conversation with, is it Mrs. Rose? I believe her name is. Is that her name? Yeah.
The school teacher.
Yes. So it's interesting to see these conversations about Christian beliefs versus pagan beliefs. But yet, even though Howie preaches that he's a Christian and a good man, there's still this sense of the Islanders being more tolerant of him than he is of them and their beliefs, of course, until the ending. But like the scene where I think he leaves a cross in the churchyard, It really isn't a churchyard anymore. It's the sense of him imposing his religion or his beliefs onto these people, which again, it's like, who is the villain in this? But Howie clearly thinks their rituals and their beliefs are crazy, as they think the same for Howie and his beliefs. So these contrasting beliefs when it comes to rituals and belief systems are something that I find so interesting. And it's always so cool to see how it plays out with both sides.
Yeah, and it's great that the film gives us both sides as well, isn't it? Harriet, what about you?
I wanted to return back to what Mike briefly mentioned, which is that the rituals often involve elements of kind of play, of games, of song, of dance, and how kind of engrossing and appealing that is for both children, but also I think for adults in the film as well. So there are various moments where, for example, like in the parade, where there's sort of like game and kind of dance like elements. And I think some of these moments I find the most disturbing. So there's one scene where Howie is kind of running around the town and there's a man in a hobby horse costume that is almost kind of like chasing him around and then hiding from him. It's like a game of hide and seek. And it's kind of comedic, but it's also really disturbing because it's kind of like that, you know, I think maybe this is a character that we haven't even met yet. It's just someone in a disguise, but it kind of gives you the sense that everyone is in on this. Everyone is kind of like toying with him, and it's a kind of like cat and mouse type game, and it's quite sinister. And also the sword game as well that they play on the hilltop is, I find, a really horrifying scene because it's very brutal, it's very impactful, and then it's all just a big joke. It's a big game. And I think that's just really disturbing for us as viewers. But I also noticed that in the parade, Howie kind of gets involved in the play element as well. So he dresses as the Punch character and he's having this kind of pretend sword fight. So I think we can see that in these kind of the kind of like the joy of these rituals, it's very easy for people to get kind of sucked into it, even if they are, you know, they don't share those beliefs.
Yeah, what you said there just makes me think how much you can like masquerade with play. The play can seem to be one thing, but actually there's a lot you can distort there. And also, yeah, with Howie, it's like these things, you know, play, song, colors, they're all really intoxicating, aren't they? And it's interesting to think about how we're getting swept up in that as well. Ali, Leslie, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, what I wanted to say is kind of related to a few things that have come up, but probably back to something Mike said earlier about how scary it is to see kind of Christianity just really reduced down to that myth behind it that points out, hey, this is another belief system. And so you've got Howie, who's I think it's crucial that we get those shots, and I didn't notice them until sort of rewatching of him at communion very early on in the film, because then it's sort of like he's going in around and judging everyone else's kind of rituals, but it's like without being able to recognize that his own a ritual and sort of buying into this sense of enchantment that he's that so many of these films are trying to shut down. And I love that. For me, the cutting moment where it's pointed out to him is Lord Summerisle when he goes up to his house and how he's just horrified at the obscenity of these women jumping through a fire. And he's like, well, what kind of religion is this? You know, why are they jumping through a fire naked? And he's like, well, because it's easier than jumping through with clothes on. Like, it's just like this disarmingly rational response to something that's just like just this complete judgment. And the other thing I was sort of thinking about while the others were sort of talking about the relationship to nature is something that I feel like watching it now we've sort of lost even more. Like I feel like maybe back in the day it'd be easier to go, oh, what a bunch of weird hippies, you know. But now that we're sort of in this space where everywhere you look we're talking about environmental catastrophe and modernity's lost its connections to nature, it seems more rational to me that they're kind of just, well, they're, like people have said before, they're connected to nature and they're honoring nature, and until the end, obviously, it doesn't seem that threatening. From some ways of looking at it anyway. But it's just, yeah, we've really lost that connection. But also what Mike was saying about the collectiveness of it being a way of no one's individually responsible. But I was thinking of it the flip side as well, in the way that that sacrifice is it's a very direct, you know, we're killing someone and it's obviously abhorrent to appease the sun god. But the way that modern kind of cultures sort of distances you from any kind of death as well. So like, you know, drones, we kill people with drones and it's no individual's fault. It's not like when you're in trenches having to stab someone with a bayonet or something. And I guess meat industries and things like that, where we sort of distance ourselves from the killing, sort of so we can go, oh, well, we're not responsible. It's just this process, and that's how it is as well. So I thought it was interesting that I think it goes both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And wow, I mean, I didn't think we'd be talking about drones tonight. It just goes to show how much this film can show up, and maybe that's part of why it endures so long, because it just continues to almost speak to whatever's happening at the time. So I'm going to ask some individual questions now, and I'm going to start with you, Lakkaya. So your specialist area of expertise is in the study of masculinity in horror, and I wondered if you could give some of your thoughts about the representations of masculinity on display in Howie and Lord Summerisle and any other of the men that we see in this film.
Yeah, great. I have many thoughts. I'll try and keep them condensed. So in The Wicker Man, it's interesting because it's almost like a battle between two father figures, if you will. So there's Lord Summerisle, who is the father of the island, like all the islanders. And it's interesting because with Lord Summerisle, some may view him as a liberal man, right? Like he loves animals. I think he says because they don't bow to one another or bow to God. But there is this element, as people have mentioned before, is he evil? I don't know if he actually believes in what he's teaching on the Summerisle, or if he just kind of plays along to keep his power and status. And everyone obeys him. He doesn't really have a hard life. So with the kind of characterization of Lord Summerisle is very ambiguous, but I do kind of see him as this power-hungry version of masculinity. And then there's Howie, who obviously takes on a father figure role in his search to save Rowan. He's, you know, a police officer and truth seeker and celibate hero to some. But I think he's an archetype of troubled masculinity. And I think this is shown through elements of power versus powerlessness. So as someone already said, Sergeant Howie is like, he's a sergeant. In our world, man of power, right? But he has absolutely no power in the Summerisles, despite being a sergeant, which I think from the get-go is a blow to his ego. I do think Howie has an ego. Like, for example, when he's landing on the Summerisles, and people say to him that he can't land there because it's private property or whatever, I think that hurts his ego, being told, you know, what to do, like he doesn't have power here. The fact that he needs to get permission from Lord Summerisle to do anything is clearly not what he's used to. And then the kind of troubled masculinity comes into Howie as well, with this repressed sexuality, I think, that we see. He clearly has some kind of feelings for Willow, the landlord's daughter, who in the film is kind of presented as this Aphrodite-esque figure. But obviously he represses this because of his Christian views. When he hears Willow having sex, we don't know if he feels he feels something, but we don't know if this is arousal or it could be disgust. And the scene where Willow's kind of singing naked in her bed to Howie, he's clearly enticed. So this is clearly a version of masculinity that is presented as having repressed sexuality, and yet he's punished for that. Because where we as a viewer are tricked into believing that Rowan is in danger, but at the end, it's Howie who takes her place as sacrificial victim, because he's a virgin as well, right? He's the right type of adult. And what's interesting about that in folk horror is where we see Howie is punished for having this repressed sexuality. In modern folk horror, with again bringing it to Midsummer, Christian, who is also another version of troubled masculinity, he's burnt alive like Howie, but he's burnt alive after surplus sexuality. So he has sex as a part of the ritual of the Haga, which, even though I argue it's still technically a rape, but he's still punished after that. So in folk horror, then there seems to be these themes or undercurrents of masculinity and sexuality as well, but men are punished either way, which I've just always found interesting. Yeah.
Wow, thank you so much, Kaya. You've given us so much to think about. I feel like me and you could do a panel on our own just on masculinity and horror. Thank you so much. Mike, I'll turn to you now. So as a licensed therapist, as a counselor, as someone who podcasts through the lens of mental health, I wondered if you could provide some comments or thoughts about assessing the Wicker Man through the lens of mental health, and any readings that you might have about that intersection between horror and mental health here.
Sure. So we covered this movie back in psychoanalysis, and we looked at like it through the lens of fundamentalism. And I'll talk about that in a sec. But the first thing that jumped out rewatching this was how at peace the residents of Summer Isles, how everybody felt like they were at peace. Like there just seemed to be no conflict with one another. They seemed in tune with themselves. They seemed in tune with each other as a community. And I'm thinking like whatever arrangements they've made, like they're all on board with it. And like these are the kind, like what they're doing, honestly, these are the steps. Like when I'm talking with my clients, I'm like, here are some things I think you should do. They are listening to music. I mean, because they're always like singing all the time. Like this is a secret musical. They're having physical contact with one another. They're engaging socially. I mean, there were no cell phones back then, but they're actually having like face-to-face contact with one another. They're going out to pubs. They're drinking. They're having actual conversation, which there's just no substitute for. They're enjoying good meal and drink. They're dancing. They're, you know, and if you're a spiritual person, not necessarily religious, but spiritual, then they're taking part in spiritual activities. And aside from the ritual sacrifice of an unwilling stranger, like these are pretty well-adjusted people. I'd be like A+. We can, you know, see each other less often. I think you've aced therapy at that point. And these are like what we would often tell people to engage in order to look after what we would call self-care now. So I just found it really, like, I kind of got a chuckle out of it watching it, being like, this is what I tell people to do. Am I somehow creating some sort of monster? Do I have to be on the lookout? But these seem like relatively healthy people. What we looked at was this idea of like, what would make a person more prone to fall under these beliefs? Why would someone become fundamental? And in this idea, like spirituality of itself and religion in of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. I think you can make an argument that organized religion is probably responsible for a lot of the atrocities that we've seen in this world. But having faith in and of itself, I would argue, is the idea of trying to make sense of the world and trying to make sense of something bigger than ourselves. It's just organized religion is when it's more about politics and power than it is about any sort of belief system. Where spirituality tends to go astray here in the Wicker Man and in the world at large, and you see this with both the Islanders and with Howie, is when it veers into fundamentalism. This idea that like one's own faith and one's own beliefs, it transcends all others. Faith becomes objective instead of subjective. That it's not faith that faith becomes fact at that point. Like what I believe is objectively true, not something that I'm holding within my heart is something that I hope is correct. And it's marked by this really inflexible, rigid thinking. It becomes like demonizing one's opponents. And you see how he engages in this a lot. You know, he's calling them heathens. He's telling everybody, like, you'll be sure that I'll make a full report of this when I go back to the mainland. You kind of get the feeling that if Howie were to go back, like, they sent Howie out there for a reason. Like, they wanted to get rid of this guy. Like, this is the guy that you're like, oh my God, can we be free of him for a couple weeks? He is just the guy that reports on all the other police officers if they're like 5 minutes late for shift. They don't want any part of him. But he's demonizing their opponents. It's rejecting evidence if it counters your own belief. Like even when you're confronted with something that counters what you believe as being factually untrue, you're going to reject that. You're going to say, well, that's fake news at that point. That's fundamentalism, and that's when faith can become dangerous. And there have been some recent studies examining damage to the prefrontal cortex, which is basically where cognitive flexibility lives. This idea that, like, can you change your thinking? Are you open to new ideas? Can you change the way you reason? Are you what we would call, like, can you have like an open mindset to things, a flexible mindset? And if there's harm to this area, does that make a person more prone to fundamentalism and to extremism? And there was one study that was conducted by Northwestern University a few years back. It looked at a panel of Vietnam veterans that had suffered from traumatic brain injury versus those that hadn't. And some preliminary adults pointed that folks that had suffered damage in this area were much more prone to inflexible thinking. And there was also this idea that they were more prone to buy into what we would call like the psychological phenomenon of like the sunken cost, that if you believe for something for so long, it becomes much harder to give up that belief. You're like, I'm just going to ride this thing to the very end. Like I would much rather say, even though in my heart of hearts, I know this not to be true, I have too much invested in this psychologically and emotionally to give up on this at this point. And they're much more prone to making radical and inflammatory statements. So this kind of person would be much more prone to maybe like join a cult or be prone to like religious fundamentalism. I'm not 100% sure that's what's going on here. This seems more like it was a system that was like in place for multiple generations. And once the Islanders hit a number of hardships, once the crops failed because there wasn't really any good crops they could grow, once crops started to bloom again, they were going to do anything they could to never have to go through those hardships again. So like any port in a storm, if you tell me this is what we need to do, we need to every now and then burn someone alive in order to have plenty of apples, in order to survive. Like if that's what it takes, we'll buy what you're selling at that point, no matter what.
Okay, like blind faith?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's also maybe like, do you think like notes of intolerance as well?
I'm not sure that the Islanders were intolerant. Howie, you could definitely say, was intolerant. Yeah. Like it was his way or the highway. He was very much, how do you have these persons not heard of Jesus? Like that was hilarious. Like Howie's hilarious. Like when you take out the last 15 minutes of this movie, like he is just funny to watch because he's so rigid in his thinking that it becomes almost like it's a sadly comical performance. Like, who here hasn't heard of Jesus? And he's almost like getting patted on the head by the end. They're kind of like tolerating him and sending him on his way. And there's the line in the movie where the young girl opens her desk and she's like, the beetle just keeps going in a circle, and he doesn't know that he's doing it. And he's like, well, why do you do it then? It's like, oh, Howie, sir, you are the beetle. Like, do you not see here? It's in this scenario, you are the beetle. Like, he has one way of approaching things because he's so rigid in his ideology and he's so rigid in his approach. And he's so clear that he thinks he's correct, that he has no other way of approaching people. Like, he just, I'm correct. Everybody clearly knows I'm correct. Therefore, I don't have to build rapport with anyone. They're just going to listen to me because, like, I'm the person in authority. And it's a clown show. It's just an absolute clown show to these folks. And it's aside from those last 15 minutes, it's like wickedly funny. Like you said, I'm sorry, like you had said, Allie, like, why are they jumping through the fire naked? Like, well, why wouldn't they be? Like, you're not going to jump through a fire with your clothes on. You'll burn up. Like, it's easier.
Thank you so much, Mike, for those wonderful contributions. Harriet, I wanted to speak to you about readings of the character of Willow, because I know you've got a keen interest in the areas of female representation, and you do a lot of work in bimboism, and you've devoted a lot of time and thought to those subjects. So I wanted to ask about the character of Willow then. How do you think we might find new readings of her, or what are your readings of her and how she's portrayed, and maybe where her power lies?
Yeah, so something I research is this figure of the bimbo, which, you know, in the cultural imagination we probably think of as being like a stereotypical dumb blonde, but there are kind of other, you know, depictions in various avenues of pop culture where this may be challenged in some way. So there might be a kind of dumb blonde type character who is actually a lot more intelligent than we think, and is maybe kind of shouldn't be underestimated. And I wonder if Willow, to some extent, fits into this, because, you know, we can see that she's a beautiful woman. She is portrayed by Britt Ekland, and we are told very early on that she's beautiful and that everyone desires her in the Landlord's Daughter song. You know, so to some extent, she is playing this kind of like blonde archetype. But I think we also see quite early on as well that she is quite a high status character in the community. And we can see this even visually. So there's a scene relatively early on where she is up in the window of the pub, and then I think it's the Lord Summer Isle comes and offers a young man to her as kind of like an offering, and refers to her as a goddess, I believe, as well. So we can see that there's definitely kind of stuff going on with her being this kind of high status woman, having a lot of agency, having a lot of control over her body and her sexuality. And I think it's her kind of sexuality and femininity that where we kind of see a lot of her power, but also with the other women as well. So the scene on the cliffs towards the end of the film when Howie is apprehended, the people that seem to be the ones who kind of pull, you know, who are pulling all the strings are Lord Summer Isle, and then the school teacher, the librarian, and the landlord's daughter. So it's very interesting to see that women seem to be having this quite kind of central influential role in the rituals, in the community, as well as, you know, an aristocratic man. I think as well, in terms of the portrayal of Willow, there's kind of interesting stuff going on with the male gaze. I think on the one hand, the film is definitely playing to the male gaze, because Willow and the other women in the film are, these kind of really archetypal, beautiful blondes, almost like Hammer horror type women. But I think there is kind of, in terms of Willow's character, there is interesting stuff going on with the kind of manipulation of the male gaze. So in her character, we can see that the film is kind of aware of what the male gaze would find enticing in terms of femininity, in terms of sexuality, and that is kind of played on in the way that she tries to seduce Howie. So the film is kind of playing on her feminine, or her character rather is kind of playing on her kind of femininity and sexuality, and using that as a source of power. I wonder as well if Willow is potentially quite an important character in terms of like choosing who gets sacrificed, because if Howie had submitted to her seduction, her advances, then he wouldn't be a virgin, and then would he still be sacrificed? So she's almost like a kind of like gateway for like who they kind of get sacrificed and who doesn't. So I think she's a very, very influential character. And something else I kind of noticed about the film, just in terms of like female representation, is that there's not a big range, there's not a large range of women portrayed. It's mostly kind of teenage girls, young kind of beautiful women, or mothers. Normally I would say that's not good representation, but I think it is kind of working in relation to how the community sees the life cycle of people and of women in that society. So there's kind of like burgeoning sexuality, ripe sexuality, and then I guess kind of faded or fading sexuality to some extent. I think that the kind of the types of women that we see are kind of representative of how that society views the kind of the sort of human life cycle and sort of people's roles in relation to like a fertility, as we kind of talked about before.
Thank you so much, Harriet. Fascinating insights there, particularly about the male gaze and the representations of women and the types of women and the life cycle. Ali, so something that is both it's something I appreciate in the film, and it's something that also I find probably the most horrific, and you actually touched on it at the top of the panel, is this idea of dread and inevitability. And we get small moments such as the one that Mike's already mentioned about the dung beetle in the child's desk being led to its death. And then we also get another moment when Howie arrives at Lord Summerall's house and he's greeted with the words, "I've been expecting you." I'm sure there's so many other examples. But what do you think about the idea of these themes? And could Howie ever have prevented his own death, do you think? And as I know I'm asking a lot of questions, if not, do you think the sense of inevitability makes the film more or less terrifying?
I'll start with your last question, maybe. I think for me, it definitely makes it more terrifying. It's a scary, very scary thing to feel like you have no agency. And in a way, I think you'll like this, Rebecca, because I can see that book behind you. It reminded me on a rewatch of, it felt like there was connections to Vertigo almost, because you've got these two characters who have the illusion of agency and really believe that they're solving a mystery and progressing the narrative and feel like that they can just make the right, discoveries, that they will, master this thing. And yet they don't realize, neither has an inkling, that they're kind of pawns in other people's convoluted plots. That being said, like you mentioned, there are moments in the film where we're kind of signaled, and I guess Howie too, if he had the awareness, but like the dung beetle and these sort of symbols that actually you are being manipulated here. But at the same time, he's they don't need to tie him up and to kind of manipulate him in the way that the dung beetle can only move in this one way, because it's physically prohibited from doing otherwise. And they know they don't need that, because for him, it's like his beliefs is that rope that kind of ties him. And so could he have prevented his own death? I think the only way he could have is if he had sort of given up on his beliefs, kind of like we were just talking about with Willow. Had he gone next door and shagged Willow, kind of, yes, it's probably the only point where he could have, you know, gotten out of it. But I think once he steps foot on that island, he's sort of done for. There's because they know who he is and we know who he is, and it's like he can make choices, and he does make choices throughout the film. So, but they're the choices that align with who he is as a person, and so in some ways he kind of has to make this set of choices, and that's what allows them to kind of manipulate him from afar. They know what's going to happen. There's, you know, he might not have punched the punch character and got the costume and that, but he would have got to that Mayday parade in some way. They know that he's going to be driven. He's going to rescue this child or try to, and so he's just making a series of choices that seem to be free will but aren't.
Yeah, I like that idea about free will, and it makes me think again about I spoke before about tragedy, and you know, with what you said there about as soon as he steps on the island, it's like it's almost a foregone conclusion. This idea of not fate, I don't think, but just things being set on a track, and it's that, you know, there's only one road, and it's how he's only going in one direction, and that's
Give
it.
him like prompts and he'll produce the answer you want. It's kind of like ChatGPT. It's like how he is the AI.
And yeah, the point about Vertigo, I'm going to have to get you on my podcast, and we'll do a Vertigo Wicker Man crossover.
Love that. That sounds very fun.
So Becci, you might get the juiciest question of all, I think, because we can't talk about this film without talking about the ending. So how does this iconic and truly terrifying ending make you feel? And I'm curious to hear about, we've kind of touched on it a little bit throughout, but where your empathy lies. You know, Howie's a man who I personally find deeply unlikable for much of the time, but he's also burnt alive and subjected to such a horrible death. So it's difficult, despite how much I might be repelled by a lot of his behaviours, to fully empathise with the Summerals and their choices as well. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, it is such an iconic ending. It's one of those films that I think even if people haven't seen The Wicker Man, they do know what happens in the end because it's been referenced so many times throughout history. And for me, it is the point in the film where all these elements that we've spoken about, like the religion, like the representation of masculinity, of femininity, of dread, it's all tied together in a nice little fiery bow, like I said earlier. In the, especially a first time watch where all these elements are in there that you don't quite know how they link, like looking for a missing girl, the fertility rituals, like it's a little bit like what is going on, and then you get to the final moments and the plan is revealed. And I think that's like one element of the ending. Another is sort of this meeting of two different minds, of two different belief sections, and it's a real interesting representation of stubborn faith, in my opinion. Like we see Lord Summerisle, especially, and the other like villagers in Summerisle, like the librarian, like Miss Rose, like Britt Eklund's character, and they're so staunchly in their view that if we sacrifice this man, the crops will grow. But then you have Howie, who is protesting with them, like, no, that's not what will happen. If that happens next year, they will fail. It's the environment is the reason. But no matter how much the other side protests, they're never going to reach any middle ground. They're both so stuck in what they think and what they want to do. The ending is, in my view, it is inevitable. It's this really interesting view of seeing two completely different parts of society meeting and the devastation of that collision, which obviously it comes to the horrific scenes that we do finally see, which I think is what roots it so firmly as a horror film. It is such like a 180 in the narrative. And it's also really fascinating how it brings in like, the imagery of fertility. We see, although it's a fiery end, we see Howie reduced to a seed in it, in that he's the seed that will be planted to grow the crops, and also the seed within the Wicker Man, like he's placed into the belly as if a fetus to grow, which I think it's really beautiful imagery as we see the Wicker Man burning and falling down. It's such a really interesting juxtaposition of this fire, this chaos, that can also be seen as conception being fiery, chaotic, a once in a million thing, and the beauty of life that comes out of it. I think when we boil down to what we said earlier about the fear of life and death in the Wicker Man, it really comes down to it in these final scenes. And we don't see whether the crops grow or not. We don't see who is right or wrong. And I think that is quite scary in the final scenes as well. We can never, I mean, me personally, I'm with Howie in that I don't think the sacrifice would work, but who are any of us to say in the world of the Wicker Man what would have worked? In terms of what you say about where my empathy lies, I think it's a strange one. I mean, I'd like to say I am team, like Mike said earlier, team don't burn people alive. That is bad. That is wrong. But I did find myself rewatching it feeling a little bit like, good, when he got burned, because he's so dislikable throughout the whole film. And the people of Summer Isle aren't. It's hard to not feel a bit of like, you've been so intolerant, you've been so horrible through this whole narrative, you have got what you deserve for not listening. And then you pull yourself back and think, oh, actually, no, this man has been burnt alive for apples, and that's not good. That's not a good thing. But it's so easy. Like Mike had said earlier, it's so easy to sort of be indoctrinated into what other people think. And I feel as a viewer, we do have that sort of relationship with the people from Summer Isle, especially Christopher Lee, who's in it so little in the grand scheme of things, but he's so charismatic. It's hard not to sort of be on their side a little bit, and it leaves you feeling a little bit dark as we see the sunset.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you made about we don't actually get to see did the crops grow or not. Really interesting, and I really appreciate that being just left unsaid. With this being the last intelligent question of the evening, I'd like to invite anyone else who wants to chip in. So if anyone's got any thoughts about the ending that they'd like to share, or any notes on empathy, then feel free to chip in.
I will if no one just because you said earlier, Rebecca, that feeling of it being a tragedy, and I feel like it is for me, even though I also felt that conflict, especially watching it today, where I'm like, he's so abhorrent and annoying and set in his ways that, and the people of Summer Isle aren't. So I completely agree with all of that. I think the tragedy for me is that Howie is for all of his puff and arrogance, he kind of is trying to do a good thing. He's trying to rescue this child. So he does have good intentions, and he sort of fails to realize that these people he keeps judging are not backwards heathens that are, left in some dark age, but they're very capable of making convoluted plans and choices and know exactly what they're doing. I also love that he's not this traditional hero that we're used to seeing. I love that there is that complexity at the ending where you feel like, hold on a minute, I wasn't really behind him, but now I felt very sorry for him watching him, I think, because it is so horrific. It's like he's forced to confront his hubris in the most horrific way probably imaginable. And so that failure to recognize what's going on is tragic, as much as I don't like him.
Yeah, I have a little bit of empathy for Howie at the very end because of what Ali just said. Like, he is trying to find justice for Rowan, and he doesn't have to. Like, he soldiers on, trying to like find out what happened to this young girl when nobody else seems to care. But also, in the end, like, he accepts his fate. Like, I think where I find empathy for him is when he starts singing at the end, and when he starts praying at the end. Like, he gets a martyr's death, and he like accepts what's happening to him. It's a bit of like with Scorsese in The Last Temptation of Christ. I think it was Becky, you had said, I'm sorry, was it Becky? It was, you'd said how, what if he had just gone and shagged Britt Eklund's character? Like, would he had at that point no longer been able to have been sacrificed because, no longer would have been a virgin. In Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ, it's all about Jesus stepping off the cross, like fantasizing about stepping off the cross and marrying Mary Magdalene and just living his life as a man. When you see that, what if Howie had that fate, but here he accepts like this is what is going to happen to him, and he prays like, okay, I'm going to die today, and he accepts that he's going to die today, and he accepts that it's his own decisions. Like he actually, I don't think he blames the others. He doesn't demonize the others at the end. He's like, this is my fate. I am resigned to it. I've tried to live my life in the best way that I've known how. You know, dear God, please accept me at your side when I'm dead. And I think there's something that is sad and poetic about that. So I do feel a bit of empathy for him at the end. Whereas like in Midsummer, I'm like, yeah, I'd pour some gas on that hut and let Christian burn alive. So, you know, it can only extend so far.
Oh, was there anyone else who wanted to comment? No? Okay, so I told you that was the last intelligent question. So in closing, I would like to throw us all a May Day parade, despite it being the 22nd of November, without any sacrifices, don't worry. So you've all got an open invitation to attend, dressed in any costume. What or who are you going to come as? And now, we don't usually do prizes at Ghouls Magazine panels, but today we make an exception because the best answer to this question will win this tin of peaches, okay? So let that be your inspiration, okay? Right. Harriet, I know you love a costume.
Well, one of my favorite like bizarre references in the film is when they go to the baker's and then they're kind of like, you know, cooking all their kind of like festive foods, and then one of them kind of just opens up a cupboard and says, that's my costume, the salmon of knowledge. And I watched this film in the cinema recently at a festival, and that everyone just fell about laughing at that reference. It just seems so incongruous. So my costume is the salmon of knowledge.
Lakkaya?
I say get some special effects. And go as the Wicker Man myself.
Oh wow.
You know, like made out of wood or something. I think that would look really, really cool. Or like, so either I could be the Wicker Man, like just made out of wood, and like I could get a piece of paper and like paint the like belly like with fire, like it's red, and you know, someone's burning inside of me. Or could go half Wicker Man, half Danny's flower thing from Midsummer. Seeing as I've compounded the two films so much today. So that's my answer.
I like that, very inventive. Wouldn't expect anything less from a fashionista like you, Lakkaya. Mike, moving on to you.
Well, it's Thanksgiving here tomorrow, so I'm going as a giant turkey. I'm just getting a giant turkey costume, lots of feathers, and I'm gonna like strut about. I think that would be lovely.
I think you'll fit right in at this parade. Ali, what about you?
I've thought about this. I'd like to come as Sergeant Howie's sexual frustration. And the way that I would do that is that I would find a police uniform. I'd hold my chin unnaturally high. And then anytime I came near some sort of wall or structure, I'd sort of just caress it and put my head up against it awkwardly until people moved away. Also, I don't know what the shipping is on peaches to Australia. So regardless of the outcome of this very important choice, you're off the hook.
Becci, what about you?
So I would be the person that had definitely read the invitation wrong. And as soon as I read Mayday Parade, my mind went straight to music. So I would be coming as vocalist Derek Sanders from the American rock band Mayday Parade. I'd have my skinny jeans on. I'll perform at the parade. I can't sing, but I'll try. I know all the words to A Lesson in Romantics. Track all the way through. So yeah, that's my costume.
Lovely. I think if anyone's interested, I was thinking I might come as like an ear of corn, um, so in fitting with the kind of harvest theme. Um, but I think the prize has got to go to Howie's sexual frustration. I mean, I need to see that. We need a video, Ali.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh dear. Watch that.
We'll put it on the Ghouls membership. Okay.
Excellent. Yeah, that's why I'm so annoyed that I'm so far away from everyone, because I see you guys having these fun parties and I'm like, I want to be there. But yeah, it's Australia. It's far.
So that brings us very sadly to the end of this discussion. Thank you first and foremost to my incredible guests, Mike, Ali, Harriet, Kaya, and Becci, for being so generous with their time and for, quite frankly, providing the intelligence to the backdrop of my absolute nonsense. Before we go, I just want to invite everyone to share where we can find you all, and please tell us about any up-and-coming projects that you've got on the slate. Becci.
Yep, you can find me over on Twitter, X, or whatever it's called at this current moment at Sayce Writes. You can find me on Blue Sky under the same name. Project-wise at the moment, I've got 2 pieces coming to Ghouls, which the lovely Rebecca is looking at the moment. I've got essays coming at Moving Pictures Film Club, and you can always find me over at Film Hens Magazine, MetroUK, and Digital Spy, writing about news, interviews, reviews, all the good things about film, mostly about horror.
Lovely. Lakkaya.
You can find me on Twitter at Lakkaya P, or Facebook. If I don't know if everyone still uses that.
She's going retro.
Yeah, retro or Facebook. In terms
MySpace. Do you have a MySpace?
I
We'll get on
was
there.
never
You do.
allowed MySpace.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Don't have it. But yeah, you can find me.
Showing my age.
Yeah, very traumatic. You can find me on Twitter at Lakkaya P. And in terms of projects, I have a journal article that's coming out soon, which will be on my Linktree, again on my Twitter. And I've also finished wrapping up my short horror film, The Shedding, which will be available to view at the start of next year, hopefully, all going well in post. Again, all updates on that will be on Twitter. And I think that's about it. Yeah.
That's plenty. Come on. Harriet.
So you can find me on Twitter. My handle is Dr. Harriet Fletch, and that is where I post most of my articles. I'm not working on anything journalistic at the moment, but I am writing a book, which is very exciting. It's called Gothic Celebrity, and it's coming out with Bloomsbury Academic. Probably not for a while because I've got to write it, but but that's the main project at the moment.
Oh, congratulations. I'm so excited for that to be released. And Ali, what about you? I'm
on Twitter as well. I annoyingly have a handle that's hard to convey. So go to Rebecca's post about the Wicker Man panel, but I'm at Preferina Pa. And I'm very slowly, although I need to get a lot quicker, chipping away at a co-written book on Nicholas Winding Refn, which I'm very excited about. If I've learned anything this morning, it's that I probably need to get up at 4 a.m. more often, and I might actually get it finished, but that will be coming eventually. Otherwise, the other exciting thing was the Umbrella release of Possession has my book in it, and it's probably, don't tell anyone, a little bit cheaper than actually just buying it from an academic press. So if you do want to read that, check it out. Wow, fantastic. And thank you for getting up so early to be here. Mike, what about you?
You can find me on Twitter at Mike_Snoonian, on Bluesky just at Mike Snoonian. Follow me at Letterboxd, though, at Mike Chump Change, because it's rather just talk about movies. Listen to my other show, The Pod and the Pendulum, We talk about horror movie franchises, although December we're doing all holiday horror and the Muppet Christmas Carol on Christmas Day. And then in January, we're going to be doing all the Universal Frankensteins, one at a time for the first couple months. And we have another project coming out that I don't think I'm allowed to announce yet, but I'll just say that listeners will love it and it will be off the hook. And look for that in 2024. And I'm super excited to get to announce it soon.
Fantastic. And please make sure that you find and follow all our guests. I have been your host, Rebecca. You can find me and my work on Twitter and Instagram at PendlePumpkin. I also write, speak, podcasts, do the occasional interpretive dance about Alfred Hitchcock. You can listen to my podcast, Talking Hitchcock, where I explore the work and the world of my favourite director on all major podcast platforms. And you can find or follow that on @Hitch_pod. Thanks to everyone for watching, whether live or on playback. We've got so much more content over on our website, so check out ghoulsmagazine.com, where you can find editorials, reviews, and listen to our Ghouls Gang podcast. You can also get access to exclusive content each month by signing up to become a Ghouls Gang member. And not only do you get loads more horror goodness, but you help support us to keep creating, and your support helps to keep us alive. So thank you so much. We will see you again soon. And remember, killing us won't bring back your apples. Take care and keep it ghoulish.